Recording. So this week, this chat session is week 4. We're moving through the third area of requirements. The way I've laid out the class, I started with the business risk requirements, then we went to the engineering design requirements, and today technology operations. And I think I've mentioned this a couple times. It's a difficult challenge to take the high-level concepts of managing risk and building a program and turn them into something that you can implement and make sure that what you're implementing is in alignment with what your overall high-level objectives are. And that's what I'm trying to achieve with this course. I may have mentioned it. Oh, is my audio breaking up? Are you having trouble?
Not appear to be.
It's working or not?
Yes, I could hear.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear too.
Okay. So the approach that I use really goes back. I've been an engineer now for 40 years, and that's always been the challenge. I mean, we think of it in cybersecurity as a difficult challenge, but honestly, when you think about anything you do, when you're building something, you have to take this high-level concept or idea of what the final product is going to look like, and then turn it into something tangible. And that's what I've been trying to do with this class. I used to design buildings. I learned in my early 20s. You not only have to do the detailed design, but you have to meet the requirements of the business owner. If you can't meet the requirements of the business owner, then you really aren't implementing the project correctly. So that's where I learned to do this. I did this when I built networks, and I also did the same approach building security programs. So we talked about business risk management requirements, and we need to start with frameworks. We talked about the risk management framework and the cybersecurity framework, and we'll discuss them in detail next week. Once again, when we get into the workloads, what are the details of the risk management framework? What are the details of the cybersecurity framework? And then last week we talked about CDM, and I spent quite a bit of time on CDM. CDM to me is the perfect link between concept and deliverable. It takes the concept of a policy and it turns it into something tangible that you can implement through tools and sensors, and then the way you can you can collect information from those tools and sensors and present them as dashboards and metrics. And in security, you cannot really see what's going on, right? The best security is invisible, where you're protecting technology, you're protecting end users. The fact that you don't know how do you know it's working? And the only way to know it's working is through dashboards and metrics that will basically display the output from the implementation program. So the tools and sensors collect information like audit logs, like events, networking events, and configuration information, vulnerability information that can then be passed on to dashboards that can display the fact that you've actually implemented the policies, right, through the controls, through the technology. You've actually implemented the policies, and that's what you're trying to do. You come up with a policy, which is a concept of where you want to go. You figure out a way how to implement that through tools and sensors, and then you measure through the output the fact that you've actually met the requirements of the policy. So what are we going to talk about this week? Today we're going to cover the detailed implementation of a policy. What are the actual controls that we implement? And in this lecture, I want to go through 4 different control standards. I'm going to go through the CIS controls, NIST 853 controls, PCI controls, ISO controls. The reason I do that is what I like to point out that there's no right or wrong control standard. They all have their place. They're all trying to achieve the same thing. And so at the end of each one of these sections where I discuss the security controls, I map them back to the NIST cybersecurity framework, which shows you that while yes, in fact, we're implementing the functions that we decided as a risk, from the risk-based program, these are the key 23, the 5 core functions and the 23 categories of controls that we wanted to implement. So it doesn't matter if you call it CIS or 853 or PCI or ISO. The bottom line is we're implementing the objectives and the categories of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So we're going to start by going through the CIS controls, and we'll come back to those later. We'll go into much more detail on the CIS controls later in the class. NIST 853, we'll go in more detail on those controls as well. I don't really do much in addition to this lecture with PCI or ISO. I could. We could just as easily build a whole program based on PCI or build a whole program based on ISO. I just give those to you as standards so that you can see that they all map back to the NIST cybersecurity framework. All of these controls get implemented through a SOC. So when we talk about tools and sensors, the people part of security that operate those tools and sensors, whose primary responsibility is to make sure that these security controls are implemented and automated through the tools and sensors, and that they produce dashboards and metrics so that validates the fact that they have in fact been implemented through the tools and sensors. And then I ended up just completing, the discussion around the global pandemic and getting into the operational kinds of control areas. So from a technology overview, how do we build secure and reliant systems and networks? That's our overall goal. We'll talk about the security controls, which are functions, countermeasures, processes, safeguards, minimize potential impact from security risks. And we're going to be implementing a defense in depth, which are layers of protection. So we implement control. We start at the risk level, strategy, policy, reports, and that's really what we just talked about a few minutes ago. The high level goals, objectives. That's where we're trying to be. We also talked about engineering, which connects the operational capabilities with the risk capabilities, and then everything else, physical, network, host, application, are all more operational capabilities on how we protect networks, how we protect systems, how we protect applications, how we protect the information itself, and then physical security as well on how we protect the access to data centers, access to facilities, etc. So we're going to start with the Center of Internet Security, 20 critical controls. It's funny, I just started the security program for a new company. I just took a new job a couple of weeks ago, and this is and the way I'm going to do this is my IT-facing security program is going to be the CIS controls. But at the same time, I document their security program based on CIS. I'm going to be keeping a second set of books, a second set of records, which is NIST 853, because if I communicate with the IT department using the CIS controls, I know through experience, because I've done this multiple times, they will be able to take these controls and implement them, and I won't have to be heavily involved with the implementation of the security program. However, I also know that this happens to be a university I work for. They have research data. There are going to be other audits done, government audits, because the research data is funded by the government. There will be third-party audits by Price Waterhouse or Deloitte, etc. There will be data privacy audits, and so I know that the CIS controls really don't get deep enough into the security capabilities. So I'm going to keep a second set of books that really outline the NIST 853 controls. And again, the reason I do that is I have two different audiences. When I communicate with the IT department, I want to make it as simple as possible for them to understand what these security controls are, and the CIS controls achieve that objective. When I communicate with the auditors, with government, with protecting well, government primarily, and a lot of other organizations use the NIST 853 controls. So that's the approach I'm taking. Just kind of reinforces the fact that you don't need to just implement a single control set. You can implement a capability, and that capability will map to multiple different types of security controls. So we'll start with the definition of what the CIS controls are. They're a prioritized set of actions that form a defense in-depth set of best practices. They mitigate the most common attacks against system and network. So that when the CIS controls were first documented in 2010, this was the statement that they were trying to achieve. Several individuals who used to work for the federal government, I know Tony Sager very well, who's really the founder of the CIS controls. He came from the Department of Defense, and his comment was, or his reason for developing these controls was, he felt that NIST 853 was too complicated, too complex for a typical organization to implement, and therefore they needed to figure out what is practical, what is doable by a broader set of organizations. And that's where they came up with CIS controls. They took best practices that mitigate the most common attack, because every control standard is really designed, or should be designed, to mitigate the most common attacks, at the same time protect systems and networks. So they formed a community of IT experts. I'm actually on the board. I have access to the CIS controls. I helped them build version 7 of the CIS controls because I've been doing it I've been using the CIS controls now for 10 years, since 2010. We apply firsthand experience as cyber defenders to create these accepted best practices. The experts who developed the controls, a lot of different sectors, and I don't remember if I included it in this in this lecture, but I have a couple of videos with myself walking through the CIS controls that I implemented for UMass. The CIS controls have been matured by an international community of individuals, share insight into attacks, root causes, translate into defensive action, document stories of adoption, track the evolution of threats, map the controls to regulatory and compliance frameworks, such as the NIST cybersecurity framework, and the share tools, working aids, translations. A lot of companies have mapped their tool sets, their tools and sensors to the CIS controls. These activities ensure the controls are not just another list of good things to do, but a prioritized, highly focused set of actions. They're grouped into 3 different categories. Category 1 is called the basic security controls, and according to CIS, they should be implemented in every organization for essential cyber defense readiness. One other thing I want to mention about the CIS controls, if you ever have any questions about how these controls should be implemented, there is a community along with CIS that will answer the question, right? If you have a question saying, hey, we're having a discussion in our organization about control 14.2, and I think it should be X, and our IT department thinks it should be Y, who's right? They will be happy to either get on the phone with you or send you their opinion or analysis of what they had in mind when they came up with CIS control 14.2, for example. But the first 6 are considered basic. Everybody should implement the first 6. They call that cyber hygiene. The next 7 through 16 controls, or I think that's 11 of them, are one step up from basic. They're technical best practices that provide clear security benefits and a smart move for any organization. These are the ones you focus on second. Actually, it's 10 of them. And then the last 4, 17 through 20, are not really technical, but they're more management type things. And we'll go through the 20 controls so you have an idea of what they are. The first 5, CIS control number 5, and again, these are all good cyber hygiene. Every organization should implement the first 5. Inventory and control of hardware devices, where we manage all hardware devices on the network. Only authorized devices are given access. Unauthorized, unmanaged devices are found and prevented from gaining access. If you don't know what's on your network, it's impossible to protect those assets. That's really what this is coming down to. You need to know what you're supposed to protect, and this goes very much in alignment with the NIST risk management framework, where they talk about the authorization boundary. The authorization boundary defines those assets that are in scope for an assessment. So you really need to know what they are. And that's what control number 1 says. What are the assets that you're trying to protect? Control number 2 is inventory and control software. Every single device, it runs some version of software. So control number 2 says, well, what software is in your network, right? You have a approved list of software or software that you've licensed, and that's the only software that should be running in your network. You shouldn't have any unauthorized or unknown or unmanaged software. You need to find it and prevent it from installation execution. A perfect example of unmanaged software is malware. Malware is not authorized, right? Malware is not supposed to be on the network. So this control really says, for all those assets that you've identified in control 1, make sure you have an understanding of what software is running on those assets. Control number 3 is vulnerability management. We need to do, and here's where there have been some debates over time. What do you mean by continuous vulnerability management? It's not necessarily scanning for vulnerabilities once a month. It's continuous. It's always understanding whether or not you have vulnerabilities in your environment. Now, scanning is one way of discovering vulnerabilities, but also tracking your patches, making sure that your configurations have been managed. There's multiple ways of doing vulnerability management. And in a couple of weeks, when we get into the details, you'll see it's not just 100% scanning, but scanning is one of those ways to help validate that, in fact, there are no vulnerabilities within your systems, or at least if you do have vulnerabilities, they're medium or low level vulnerabilities and not critical or high vulnerabilities. The 4th control, administrative privileges. Why do we want to protect administrative privileges? Because they have access to information that is from more than one individual. Think of a database administrator. They have access to the entire database. Think of an HR administrator, right? It doesn't have to be technical. It could also be on the business side. An HR administrator has access to all HR information. So those individuals with roles that allow them to have administrative functions, we're going to want to make sure we control those. And number 5 is basically configuring your devices, your mobile devices, laptops, workstations, and servers. Because configuration management and vulnerability management, we talked about those last week. Actually, if you look at these 5 controls and you map them to what's on the network, HWAM, SWAM, VUL, and configuration settings management, or CSM, are all listed here, right? They're 4 out of the 5, and then administrative privileges is who's on the network, right? Priv, this is Priv. So you can see a really strong alignment between the CIS controls and the CDM program. The 6th control is maintenance, monitoring, analysis of audit logs. That maps to what's happening on the network. Operate, monitor, and improve. You can't monitor unless you're collecting logs, and these logs allow you to monitor. This is the 6th capability for the cyber hygiene function that we talked about earlier. The rest now start to get into nice to have, but not necessarily cyber hygiene. Email and web browser protections. Why email and web browsers? Those are the 2 most common attack vectors. Most attacks occur either through email or through web browsers. An attack on individuals, right? Web servers are also subject to attack, but email and web browsers are more commonly attacked because they're typically users are involved with both email as well as internet surfing or surfing URLs, so web browser, which turns back into the web browser. So that's why email and web browser protections. And it's really good because if you implement these security controls that we'll cover in a couple of weeks that focus on email and web browser, you're going to go a long way in eliminating attacks against your probably most vulnerable areas. Control 8 is malware defenses. How do we control the installation, spread, execution of malicious code? Control 9 is really a configuration thing, a limitation and control of ports, protocols, and services, because you really want to only allow minimal configurations of ports, protocols, and services, only what you need to run the software and to connect this to the to the systems that are connecting to it, and nothing more, right? You disable everything else. You only listen on those ports that are necessary based on the function of the applications require. Number 10 is data recovery, making sure that you have a second copy of data so that you can recover if, in fact, you lose your primary copy of information. 11 is secure configuration again, but now we're focusing on network devices like in firewalls, routers, and switches. Number 12 is the boundary defense or our perimeter security capabilities. 13 is data protection. How do we protect the data itself? 14 is controlled access based on the need to know. Now, instead of having a limited configuration where we talk about ports, protocols, and services, we have now least privileges where we talk about user access, right? Same concept. Only provision the least amount of access that is required for individuals. Don't provide a general user with administrative permissions, right? Just provide them with the least permissions that they need to perform their function. Wireless access control is securing the wireless network. Account monitoring and control is now just, this ties into the audit log thing. Now we're monitoring. Now we're looking at, what's happening on the network. We do that through account monitoring. Who's logging in? When are they logging in? Where are they logging in from? Is there any suspicious activity going on with accounts? Implement a security awareness and training program. 17, 18, 19, and 20, as I mentioned before, we're kind of getting out of the technical areas and more into the business management areas. Security awareness program. Actually, application software security is technical. I'm not sure why they organized it here. The other ones are less. But application software security, most of these controls focus on infrastructure, but we certainly have to secure the application as well. Incident response and management, how do we respond to incidents? And then pen tests and red team exercises, how do we test our security and make sure it's working? Those are the 20 critical controls. And what I always do is map the controls back to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So here's a diagram that shows a very strong alignment between the CIS controls and the NIST framework. And I know last week we showed the mapping of the CDM program back to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Any questions on the CIS controls before I move forward and talk about NIST 853? You had a question, Daniel?
Yeah, I was just curious. It seems like these are meant to be implemented sort of ordinally to at least have the basic set of requirements in place or basic measures in place. Is it ever the case that organizations sort of pick and choose different elements, or do most places that implement CIS do it in an ordinal fashion?
Yeah, it's a great question, and so yes. As a matter of fact, CIS, and this is where I differ with CIS. CIS recommends you implement the first 6 first, and then you decide, okay, that's how you can mature by looking at the other ones. Whenever I do an assessment, I assess all 20. Actually, there's about 150 when you get to the subcontrols. I just want to know, right? I mean, I don't think it changes the answer, because then you're going to have to put a POAM in place and decide where you have controls gaps, which you're going to remediate. But going back to your original question, Daniel, yeah, there are a lot of organizations that say, let's just focus on the first 6, the basic security controls, not the foundational ones, and let's do it that way. And again, my recommendation, just because, and this is why I recommend what I recommend. Well, what are you trying to achieve here? We're trying to achieve protection before, during, and after the attack. I want to know red, green, and yellow of all 20 of these CIS controls, just so I know, right? We're probably never going to be 100%, but let's at least let's measure over just more than just the 6, right? Because if I change this chart and just showed 6, you'd see much less coverage of the NIST framework. But to answer your question, yeah, a lot of organizations look at it exactly that way. Let's really prioritize and focus on the 6, and then maybe we'll move to some additional ones. Okay, the next standard is NIST 853. This is kind of going to the other extreme, and it depends on the systems that you're trying to protect. Whether if you recall, when we talked about the risk management framework, we talked about tailoring out controls. So 853 says if you've got certain types of systems that they look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and they could say, well, there's high, if it's high in all three of them, there's about 450 controls, right? High risk in confidentiality, high risk in integrity, high risk in availability. But if it's low, 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 you're down to pretty much where the NIST 800-171 CMMC is around 100 to 110, and now they're at these things are moving targets, right? They're moving CMMC back up to 130 or so. But I guess my point is NIST 853 is the control standard where tailoring is done. So you can start tailoring out some of the specific controls depending on the environment. I just finished a project for the government that was high in, it was medium in confidentiality, low in availability and integrity, which meant there's secret information stored on this computer, so we want to keep that secret information confidential. So we want to use a medium classification for confidentiality. But we're not so worried about integrity. We're not worried about that information changing. We just don't. These happen to be State Department drawings, right? Architectural drawings for State Department buildings. We're not worried about somebody changing the drawings, right? We're not worried about somebody logging in and modifying the drawings. We're really worried about people getting access to the drawings. So medium for confidentiality, low for integrity, and low for availability. If the computer systems crash, they're not a big deal. You have a second copy, go to get it off the second copy. Real time transactional is not an issue there. That's my example of how you can tailor these different controls. So all the controls that had to do with confidentiality were included, but we were able to go a little bit lighter on integrity and a little bit lighter on availability. So we ended up with 290 controls. Instead of the 454 controls, there were 290 controls. And as I mentioned before, if you look at NIST 800-171, there used to be 110 controls, but with CMMC, I think they're going back to 130 or 140. But all of this has to do with tailoring. But these are the 18 control families: access control, and notice that they're alphabetical. Access control, awareness and training, audit and accountability, security assessment authorization, configuration management, contingency, etc. Now, these I tend to do my own internal. I like to build my own security program when I'm doing. I've done 6 consulting engagements using NIST 853. I tend not to spend an awful lot of time reviewing these controls with the client because these are a little bit more abstract than the CIS controls. I've walked through the CIS controls with CFOs and CIOs many, many times, and they get it, right? And you'll see as I go through the class, it's pretty easy to understand the value of the CIS controls. It's a little bit harder with NIST 853. You're getting into some pretty abstract areas, but I use it because it's more comprehensive than the CIS controls, right? And I want, for my own knowledge, my own satisfaction, I want a comprehensive program. So what I'm doing with this new engagement that I'm working on now, right? My new CISO role, I'm doing the CIS controls for the CIO. So our CIO thinks that I'm building their security program based on the CIS controls, which I am. But in the background, I'm mapping those same security controls to NIST 853. So let me just walk quickly through 853. And I'm going to get into the details of 853 in a few weeks when I talk about policies. A lot of policies are written based on 853. If you look at state government, many state government security policies map to NIST 853. Because they're government entities, they need to implement government control standards. So the state of Illinois is a good example. The state of North Carolina, the state of Virginia, they all have on their websites their security policies, and their security policies mapped to NIST 853. So access control, again, they're alphabetical order, and this is just a high-level description. We're going to get into the details a little bit later in the class. A fundamental component of data security dictates who's able to access what, right? Ensures users are who they say they are, and they have appropriate access to company data. If I remember correctly, and I think I'm right on this, there are 25 subcontrols under access control. So access control alone has 25 subcontrols under it. The next is awareness and training. Why does that come after access control? Because it's alphabetical, right? A formal process for educating employees. So there's a set of controls that focus on awareness and training. The third area is audit and accountability. Now, this is exactly why I use NIST 853. I had a discussion with my security team today. They've been running a SOC for a number of years, and I asked them, what are you actually collecting for audit information in your SOC? And they said, well, you know, we're doing a little of this, a little of that. You know, we're grabbing what we think is important. Now, AU2 from the audit and accountability control details out everything you should be collecting in an audit log. And it's very detailed. So whenever I go to a SOC or an operations, I said, you know, these are the things that you should be auditing. These are the things that you should be looking at for events. That's not covered in the CIS controls. CIS Control 6 talks about audit logs, but they don't talk about the in-depth requirements of what you should be including in your audit logs, which is precisely the way I go back and forth between 853 and CIS, because, well, I want to know if I'm going to set up an auditing function for an organization, I don't want to be guessing what they should be auditing. I want to build it against a standard. And if you look at AU2 with NIST 853, you're going to see a lot of detail on what should be included in the audit logs. So that gives you an example of why I kind of look at different controls. If I want to look at, for example, security controls at the application layer, I look at PCI. PCI has an application security requirements section that is more detailed than any of the other NIST or CIS or any of the other control standards. You know, so if you're going to say, hey, I want to build an application security program, the first place I would go would be PCI, because PCI does a really good job. They focus on the OWASP top 10, but they not only describe the top 10, but they also describe exactly how you should test for those types of vulnerabilities, the OWASP top 10 applicable vulnerabilities. So I'm spending a little time going through this. I'm not going to cover the whole thing tonight, obviously, but to give you an idea of why I have more than one control family or control standard in my toolkit. I might be building a program based on CIS, but in the back of my mind, I know where the NIST 853 controls are. I know where the PCI controls are. I know where the ISO controls are, the HIPAA controls. I want to know as much as I can so that I can build the strongest, best security program. Okay, so these are, again, the NIST 853 families. There are, which CIS controls organization asked them to explain to clarify. Yeah, so NIST 853 does as well. Ron Ross is really the director of NIST, and you can send Ron Ross an email. And there are a few names on the NIST 853 standard, but they are not as accessible as the CIS organization, in my opinion, Twan, right? Maybe because I just know the folks at the Center for Internet Security a lot better. I've worked with them. They're a lot. I believe they're a lot more probably more. In my opinion, they're more approachable than from NIST. But it probably depends on your experience and your some of your work and experience as well. And quite honestly, I've never had to ask anybody from NIST because NIST has really two documents, actually more than that now, but they have NIST 853, which is the standard, and then they have NIST 853A, which is how you test for the controls. So if the description of the control is 853, the testing of the control is 853A. So you can, if you don't quite understand what you're reading in 853, you can go to 853A, and you'll get even more information on how the test is actually conducted, which can help you get a better sense for what the control is looking for. But back to your original question, I'm pretty sure if you ever have a question on this 853, there are a handful of people that are listed as the authors of that standard. I know Ron Ross, he was the director, but I'm pretty sure you get your questions answered as well. So anyway, these are, they're alphabetical order. And definitely send me a note in the chat if you've used these, if you're familiar with these. I really, really, really like them. When I was early in my career as a CISO at UMass, I stayed away from NIST 853. I just found it overwhelming. But since I've done a half a dozen projects now, I really like it because I really like the detail. I really like the the completeness, in my opinion, of this standard. I don't think CIS is as complete as NIST 853. I don't think any standard is as complete as NIST 853. And you can see a very strong alignment with NIST 853 also to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So by now you're getting used to my approach, right? I want to make sure that there is everything I do maps to the framework. And again, the framework, because it protects you before an attack with the identify and protect core functions, during the attack with the protect and detect core functions, after the attack with the respond and recover core functions. So I want to know if I put a security control in place, is it stopping me before something happens? Is it picking up something while it's happening? Is it helping me recover from something that's already happened, right, during or after the attack? Notice under identify, there's a lot of controls under governance. You would not see that with CIS because CIS is more technical. It doesn't really have any governance controls, I don't believe. I'm going to quickly go back and see. Only 4 slides back, so. Yeah, well, 19, which is incident response. So basically, there's no governance in the CIS controls. It's all technical. So therefore, you see a lot in the purple and in the yellow, right? Because that's the technical part of the framework. You see a much stronger distribution of controls with 853 because they're management controls, they're administrative controls, and they're technical controls. So they're, again, in my opinion, they're more comprehensive. They're covering not just the technical aspects, but again, the reason I spend most of my time with IT department with the CIS controls is because they're mostly interested in technology. They're not generally interested in management and administration. So I want them to get the job done. So I share with them the information that they not only, are used to, in their job, but also I have a better chance of getting that implemented. And then all I do is map them back to NIST. So hopefully that makes sense to you, how you could easily do that, right? A control is a control. It's going to be somewhere. It's going to be in every one of these standards. It might be in a different place, but if you implement, for example, multi-factor authentication, which is one of the controls for the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, you're going to find an equivalent multi-factor authentication control in 853. It's going to be part of access control, multi-factor authentication. So you see what I'm saying? The capability of multi-factor not only maps to CIS, but also maps to NIST 853. The PCI data security standard, I would highly recommend, even if you don't work with credit cards, I just feel that this control standard is so well written that it really helps clarify things that you might have a question with when you get to either NIST or CIS. So therefore, I always keep a copy of PCI Data Security Standard with me, and they have their own sort of framework, right? They have 6 focus areas for their framework: build and maintain a secure network, protect data or cardholder data, maintain a vulnerability management program, implement strong access control measures, regularly monitor and test networks, and maintain an information security policy. The first 5 are all technical. Number 6 is the business functions, right? It's the management capabilities, all grouped under what's called a security policy. So they have a dozen requirements, 12 requirements that map to these 6 areas. The 12 requirements are: install and maintain a firewall configuration to protect data, do not use vendor-supplied defaults for system passwords, and really they're getting into configuration management on control number 2. Number 3, protect stored data, cardholder data, and number 4, protect data in transmission. If you look at those controls, those are very good data security controls, right? Whether it's at rest or in motion, those are good data security controls. Control number 5 is antivirus program, maps very closely to the malware detection program for CIS. Number 6 is what I had mentioned before: develop and maintain secure systems and applications, where they really get into the application security program. 7, 8, and 9 is access control. So as you would guess, 7, 8, and 9 map to access controls for NIST 853, map to administrative permissions and controlled access based on business need to know for the CIS controls. So there's a very strong alignment across all 3 of these standards. And these are the details with PCI: install and maintain a firewall configuration, do not use vendor-supplied pass defaults. And I'm just here listing the high-level description. I'm not going to read it. If you're interested in the details behind PCI, I'm not going to cover them in the class. I feel like if you understand CIS controls, if you understand NIST 853, you can find your way around any of these control standards. And again, the reason I include all 4 of them in this lecture, I just want to give you an idea that in the end, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't really matter which control standard you use. The importance is to understand more than one, so that you have not only it helps you understand that one you're working with in more detail, but it also shows you that in general they all are intended to do the same thing. They're intended to protect. They're intended to implement the risk management framework process and the cybersecurity framework functions. That's really what the intent of all the security controls are, which is once again why I choose to map them back, right, to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Here's the PCI mapping back to the NIST cybersecurity framework. And the last standard that I include is ISO 27000. ISO 27000 in the year 2009, 2010, 2011, this was what everybody was using. Before the CIS controls, they would use ISO because, quite honestly, I think people felt that NIST 853 was too detailed. The CIS controls were maybe not detailed enough. ISO is an international standard, so if you're doing international work, you would use ISO 27002. I worked for a couple international companies who used ISO 27002. I personally didn't like it because I felt it was a little bit, it wasn't operational enough for me. It didn't get into the details as much as I like. Either NIST gives you, PCI gives you, and even to a certain extent CIS gives you. But I can walk you through some of these controls. It starts with number 5, information security policy. 6, organization of information security, which is really focused on governance. 7, human resources security, which is included in PCI, and it's also included in NIST 853, but it's not included at all in the CIS control. So that's basically, security around people. Who's on the network? It's the trust and behave. It's more the trust it's trust and behave. Trust and behave are the non-technical aspects of people, human resources. And then asset management, access control, you find them everywhere, right? Asset management is hardware, software hardware and software on your network, as well as the configuration. Access control is, who has access to those devices. Cryptography is obviously protecting data, protecting passwords. Physical environmental security is the physical security controls, which we don't have any of those in CIS. We do have them in PCI, and under access control, one of the 3 access control categories in PCI is physical access control. We also have them in NIST 853. 12, 13, and 14. Think of 12 as system security, 13 is network security, 14 is application security. So those are like the 3 key IT security areas. 12 focuses on, Windows, Linux, endpoints, managing the systems. 13, it focuses on managing the networks. And 14 focuses on managing the applications. And then 15, 16, 17, and 8, we go into more management stuff, non-technical stuff. Supplier relations, which is third parties, managing third parties, incident management, business continuity management, and then compliance. Compliance with your own internal policy, which you defined in 5, right, is your information security policy, as well as compliance with any regulatory requirements, such as PCI or mass privacy or any regulatory requirement that you fall under. So this is ISO, it's an internationally recognized standard. Like governance and risk management, information security management is a broad topic. All organizations have to have a management capability. That's really what they were looking at, is more of a management function for information security, although they do get into some of the technical areas as well. ISO is organized. I just walked through the 14 security control clauses, which starts with policy, governance, human resources, asset management, access control. Underneath those 14, there are 35 control objectives. Underneath those 35 objectives, 114 controls. And this has not been updated since, oh my gosh, 2013. The last time this was updated was 2013. So if you download the ISO standard, and the reason I don't include the ISO standard in the class is you have to pay $110 to get a copy of it. I didn't want everybody in the class to have to pay $110, given the fact that we really don't go into it too much. But if you do want to, look at the ISO standard, ISO 27002, you'll see that the last time it was published was in 2013. It hasn't been updated since then. And you can do that with management stuff, but you got to be a little bit more up to date, I feel, when technical stuff. CIS's objective is to update every year. Now they've fallen behind a little bit. We're on version 7, but for a while there, they were updating every single year, but they're more technical. PCI updates every 3 years. NIST 853 Rev 4 has been around probably 4 or 5 years now. They're trying to get to version 5. I think they might even be at version 5 now, but most people still use version 4. But ISO hasn't updated in 7 years. But if you look at sort of their definition of security, maybe it doesn't have to be updated so much because there's more management type stuff, less technical operational stuff. So here are the 14 control clauses and the 30-something, what did they say, 35, I believe, 35 control objectives. First control objective is management direction for information security, which is what the policy gives you. That's consistent with what we've said before, right? That's what a policy is. Organization of information security, internal organization, that's governance. Lay out the roles, responsibilities, allocate them to individuals, that's really governance. And then they put in mobile devices and teleworking. I'm not sure why that goes in this, I've never had a good explanation of why mobile devices and teleworking fits under organization of information security, but that's where it is. So and by the way, when I was working with ISO, it was back in 2010. So I was using the 2004, I believe, edition of ISO. Mobile devices and teleworking wasn't there because they didn't have mobile devices in 2004. They added that in 2013. I don't think they knew where to put it, so they put it in Organization of Information Security. Human resources security, 3 different stages of an employee's life cycle: prior to employment, during employment, and then termination and change of employment, what the requirements are. More management, less technical. If you look at asset management and you read the control objectives, you can see they really don't get into the technical aspects of asset management. Responsibility for assets, who owns these assets, classification of information, what is it, secret information, is it public information, how do you classify the information, then how do you handle the media? So that's why I kind of say it's more of a management type standard, less of a technical standard. And even access control, business requirements of access control, user access management, user responsibilities, system application access control, not really getting into the details of permissions and passwords and authentication and authorization, not getting into the technical aspects at all. Cryptographic controls, again, to protect sensitive information. Under physical and environmental, secure areas and equipment. Here is the operation security, which again is more like the hardware, software, system security, operational procedures, protection from malware, backups, logging, monitoring, and they don't get into any detail on what you log. That's why I look at NIST 853 Control Family AU for that, audit and accountability. Control of operational software, vulnerability management. So you just get an idea of what ISO is. It's management type stuff. Honestly, since I stopped working with ISO, I don't think I've looked at the ISO standard except for, when I teach this class in a large number of years. But if you work for an international company, there's a very good chance that you're using ISO. A lot of international companies use ISO. At State Street, I worked at State Street Bank for a while. We were international, and we used ISO. But there is, once again, a very strong mapping of the ISO 27002 controls back to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So you get the idea. I'm not going to go through the SOC part or the COVID-19 part, but you get the idea of the security controls. That's really what I wanted to accomplish tonight and in this week's lecture. The bottom line is, try to learn as much as you can about as many as you can. It just makes you more valuable. You're only going to probably implement one in your particular organization. I don't know which one you'll use depending on what your business is. If you work for the government, it's going to be NIST 853. I like to use the CIS controls because I find that they're the easiest to implement, but I think they're pretty good anyway. But if you know more than one, then you can always sort of leverage the capabilities in multiple of these standards, to help reinforce your own knowledge, your own comfort, and your own competence when you build these things. It just makes you that much better, in my opinion, of an engineer, because you understand not only the basics of what you have to do, but you understand a lot more than choose what you choose and have a broader understanding of how these things work. So that's going to do it for tonight. Have any questions? Definitely send me a note or definitely contribute to the discussion board. Other than that, I hope everybody has a good week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Oh, class paper. So the question on the class paper. So the topic is week 6, and the paper is week 13. So all I'm looking for with week 6 is just, what do you think you want to write about, Anusha? Just maybe 2 or 3 sentences. I want to write on ransomware, or I want to write a paper on the CIS controls, or I want to write a paper on, some data breach, I don't know, Equifax data breach. Whatever is of interest to you for the paper, but week 13 will be the actual paper itself. Yeah, introduction in week 6, details in 13. Correct. So my whole goal in doing this is so you won't wait till week 13 to start thinking about it. I want you to think about it in a couple weeks, and then so you're prepared in week 13. But if you put something in week 6 and you change your mind, then definitely, you can do that too. You can definitely do that too. So, all right, everybody. I hope you have a good night, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.